Good morning. Today, yes, is May the 4th. May the 4th be with us all. It is a Monday. It is also a very big day for those of us who are taking the AP exam. Today, you should have received your AP materials, meaning the AP ticket and all sorts of information about taking the exam. In Canvas this morning, I'll be submitting a small amount of, small amount of information. Friday, I talked for an hour, read that whole thing, although it'd probably be better if you had your own copy. And I've sent you a lot of things. Please go over it very carefully, because we're really getting down to crunch time. And if you haven't received anything directly from the College Board, directly from the testing, it is time to make some noise. Look in your clutter folder, look in your junk mail. Oftentimes when there are large amounts of things being sent out, used to, for a while, my paycheck was being sent to junk mail by the computer. Thanks, computer. And so, look everywhere first. And then contact Miss Coleman at Ryle in guidance. I recommend calling. But send an email, call, get on the same page. Because this is crunch time. We have just over a week before the real thing. Okay. Now, today we're going to talk about the Enlightenment, continue talking about the Enlightenment, which is, what we were working on last week. Will our review take us to 1914? I don't know. We're going to try. I don't know if we'll get there, to be honest. I don't think we will. But at the same time, that was what we were studying right before we left for the beginning of NTI. I really did think it was more important to begin going over the things that we studied at the beginning of the year. The Renaissance, Reformation, because once again, this test, and I do think it's going to be something that spans a long period of time. Fair game is now the Renaissance. Fair game is now 1450. And, having information like that, is very, very helpful. Once again, this is an open note test. It's an open book test. The only problem with that is if you spend a lot of time doing this right here, suddenly 45 minutes is gone. And also, log in 3:30, exam starts at 4 o'clock, and threaten your family on their life. Little brother cannot play Fortnite when you're taking the AP exam. And they expressly mention Fortnite because it uses so much bandwidth. You need to have all the bandwidth. Goodness. They can do without Fortnite. Read a book, for goodness sake. Anyway, so let's begin. That's enough for that. Let's talk about I hope you have your Age of Science and Reason. Age of Science and Reason notes pulled up. One more thing, Thursday we took a DBQ. I have since graded all the DBQs, and please look at what I did. Not just the grade, but I wrote comments for every person who I received a DBQ from. Those of you for whom I'm not receiving, homework, You know, I mean, that's an opportunity. I'm not trying to fail anybody. I'm not trying to overburden anybody. That's an opportunity for you to perform this function that you're going to be doing in about 10 days and 9 days, and then get feedback. And yeah, I also, the computer graded your review quiz. There will be another review quiz on Friday. You know, it's all about just information, getting ready for this exam. 45 minutes to get a full semester's credit at college level. Because one day this stupid virus will be over and you'll be going back to college, you know, and living a normal life. Yeah. So let's begin talking about this, the Enlightenment, Roman numeral 5. The most monumental work, printed material, that typified the Enlightenment was this thing called the Enlightenment Encyclopedia. Compiled by Denis Diderot, who normally is the name that's given first billing, and Jean Léron d'Alembert, both Frenchmen. It had 17 volumes of text and 11 volumes of, they didn't have photographs, but illustrations, pictures. I would have liked that. More than 100 authors had been solicited on all the major philosophers. Yeah, I mean, it's an encyclopedia. It's, you know what an encyclopedia is. It's just a collection of general information. It included the most advanced critical ideas of that time on religion, government, and philosophy. Not to mention, of course, things about general knowledge. Don't know much about history. Don't know much about biology. Don't know what a slide rule is for, Mr. Lynn. But I do know that I love you. And I know that if you love me too, what a wonderful day it would be. Anyway, Sam Cooke, by the way. It included the most advanced critical ideas, to avoid official censure. So they had to get a little tricky here because remember, once again, they were not printing a book in a free society. This book was still being published in France, which was an absolute monarchy, who was very sensitive to any sort of criticism. So to avoid official censure, meaning the government taking their books off the shelves, these ideas often had to be hidden in obscure passages of articles. In other words, they would have an article about something about, like, as it says there, manufacturing, canal building, construction, improved agriculture. And then inside that article, they would make references to controversial opinions of the Enlightenment thinkers, believing that the people who read the book wouldn't read the whole thing. It did have illustrations of manufacturing, canal building, construction, and improved agriculture. It was an important sort of knowledge about 18th century social and economic life, which is our next unit, by the way, life in the ancient regime. The articles on politics, ethics, and society ignored divine law and concentrated on humanity and its immediate well-being. And once again, here it is again, it looked to the classics. It looked to the classics of Greece and Rome, meaning that these readers and writers, I mean, they thought that the smartest people who ever lived were the ancient Greeks and Romans. And so they used many of the philosoph, writers, thinkers used the ancient Greeks and Romans as a model for everything. And so it says they look to the classics of Greeks and Rome instead of to Christianity for both intellectual, but also for ethical. Ethical, meaning what should I do morally, models. The good life, according to the Enlightenment thinkers, was in the here and now and was to be achieved through the application of reason to human relationships, which obviously is a flaw. The application of reason to human relationships. Human relationships, by their very nature, are unreasonable. Love, hate. You can't get logic out of that. For many, but not all philosophers of the 18th century, ecclesiastical institutions were the chief impediment to human improvement and happiness. And you're going, what? Basically, the philosophers felt that that organized religion was the major roadblock to being happy, to being a whole person. That's what it means. Okay? Voltaire crushed the infamous thing. I believe there was a reference to him in the DBQ. Summed the attitude of a number of philosophers toward the church and Christianity. Almost all varieties of Christianity, but especially Roman Catholicism, felt their criticism because Roman Catholicism was still the most powerful church and non-governmental organization in all of Europe. And to be real honest, the Roman Catholic Church was, yes, it was a religious organization, but in many places it was also a government organization. Many members of the Roman Catholic Church occupied high offices in governments, particularly in France. Say again, cardinals and bishops and things like that also occupied positions in secular governments. Quite common. So, where are we at? The clergy taught that humans were basically depraved, becoming worthy only through divine grace, meaning that the standard belief of Christianity, the priest, was that human beings, the only way a human being can become whole is through intervention of God. Well, that's exactly opposite of what the philosophers thought. Philosophers thought that man can perfect himself. According to the doctrine of original sin, meaningful improvement in human nature on earth was impossible. So, in other words, the philosophers are saying, the church believes that because of original sin. You say, what's original sin? Original sin is the idea that all humans are born to sin. It is their natural state. Philosophers say, no, it's not their natural state. Human beings can be inspired to do great things. Mired in conflicts over obscure doctrinal differences, the church has promoted intolerance and bigotry, inciting torture, war, and other forms of human suffering. Here, the philosophers have a point. And I'm sure you're all saying, Mr. Horton, too many big words altogether. I'm not getting it. Well, basically, it just means that over the last few centuries of European history, there have been all these religious wars, and where the point of contention, the point of argument, was some infinite, tiny little point of dogma. How many angels can dance on the head of a pin? The churches were deeply enmeshed in the power structure of the old regime. Yeah, we've already talked about that, how meaning members of the church hierarchy were also members of the government hierarchy, which is one reason why our government has this idea of separation of church and state. They, meaning the churches, owned large amounts of lands and collected tithes, 10%, from peasants before any secular authority collected their taxes. The upper clergy in most countries were relatives of the aristocrats and were heavily involved in politics, serving in the British House of Lords and advising princes on the continent. It's just no way of saying that members of the church were invested. Members of the churches were entrenched in the government. So the philosophers were responsible for the birth of a quasi-religious movement called deism. We already went over that somewhat. The philosophers sought a religion without fanaticism and without intolerance, a religious life that would largely substitute the authority of human reason for the authority of churches. Newton had convinced many writers that nature was rational. Therefore, the God who created nature must also be rational, and the religion through which that God was worshipped should also be rational. In other words, this is the logic, the groundwork for the establishment of this new religion of deism. Yes, the cult of the Supreme Being. The earliest Christian work, Christianity Not Mysterious by John Toland, promoted religion as a natural and rational rather than a supernatural and mystical phenomenon. Deists regarded God as kind of a watchmaker, a divine watchmaker who had created the mechanism of nature, wound up the clock, and then simply walked off. Two major points of the deist creed about religion. The first was a belief in the existence of God. And so deists are not atheists. Say again, deists are not atheists. They believe in a God. It's just that this God made the earth and then, kind of wound up, set it down, and said, hasta la vista, see you later. First was a belief in the existence of God, which they thought was proven empirically by the existence of nature, meaning that the deists thought that, this world, as complicated as it is, had to have somebody design it. That's all it means. There was a belief in life after death, when rewards and punishments would be meted out according to the virtue of the people and their lives on earth. Deism was empirical, meaning that if you can't prove it, it didn't exist. Remember Thomas Jefferson's Bible. Anything that sounded out of the ordinary, not logical, not reasonable, he cut it out. That's what that means. Deism is empirical. If it doesn't make sense, it doesn't belong in the new faith. Tolerant, reasonable, and capable of encouraging virtuous living. Deists hoped that their faith would gain following and end religious strife, and also remove the need for priests and ministers, because priests and ministers held positions in society that were up here and everybody else was down here. All right, Rule 8. According to the philosophers, religious toleration was a primary social condition for the virtuous life. So the deists believed in, by and large, in religious toleration. By and large, they did. Although many deists were anti-Semitic. And so their religious toleration did not extend to Judaism. Voltaire took the lead in championing the cause of religious toleration. Voltaire made the case of Jean Calais, a man accused and tortured and strangled for having murdered his son to prevent the son from becoming Catholic, and made that his cause célèbre. In other words, Voltaire, holds up this case of this guy, Jean Calais, who had been executed because he murdered his son to keep the son from becoming Catholic. That whole situation is about religious intolerance. He published Treatise on Tolerance. That should be Treatise on Tolerance. How can you make that mistake, Mr. Horton? Treatise on Tolerance, and hounded the authorities for a new investigation. The case against the dead father was reversed. Voltaire said the case illustrated the fruits of religious fanaticism, obviously. Later in the century, Gato Lessing wrote Nathan the Wise, which sent a plea for tolerance for not only Christians, but for non-Christian denominations as well. Some philosophers desired not only to make Christianity more tolerant, but to attack Christianity outright. Voltaire routinely questioned the truthfulness of priests and the morality of the Bible. Scottish philosopher David Hume, you come up against those names, who knows? But David Hume, in his Inquiry into Human Nature, argued that no empirical evidence supported the belief in divine miracles central to much of Christianity. We've already went over this before. Hume just thought, if it doesn't make sense, if it doesn't make logic, it's in the Bible, it doesn't exist. For Hume, the greatest miracle was that people believed in miracles. Edward Gibbons who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Edward Gibbons attributed the rise of Christianity to natural causes rather than the influences of miracles and piety. And you can make a case for that. Didn't say it was right, but yeah. The philosophers criticized not only Christianity, but also Judaism more vehemently, even though they sponsored religious toleration. Yeah, the philosophers as a group, not all, but as a group, were anti-Semitic. That's a good thing to keep in mind. It's a little piece. Some philosophers criticized Judaism as more primitive than Christianity. Certain Enlightenment philosophers allowed certain Jewish intellectuals to rethink the relationship of Jews and their place in Jewish life. Baruch Spinner and Moses Mendelssohn were two examples. Spinner wrote in his book Ethics that closely identified God and nature, or the spiritual and material world. During his lifetime, the controversial character of his writing led both Jews and Protestants to criticize Spinner as an atheist. At 24, he was excommunicated by his own synagogue and lived apart from the Amsterdam Jewish community. Spinoza believed the Hebrew Bible provided Jews with divine legislation, but not specifically theological knowledge. This is all minutiae. He called on Jews and Christians to use their own reason in religious matters and to read the Bible like other ancient books. Moses Mendelssohn, often called the Jewish Socrates, pushed for the assimilation of Jews into modern European life. Mendelssohn argued for the possibility of loyalty to Judaism combined with the adherence to rational Enlightenment values. Mendelssohn's most acclaimed work was Jerusalem on the Ecclesiastical Power and Judaism, where he argued both for maintaining a religious distinction of Jewish communities. Once again, a lot of this is minutiae. He felt that government should be religiously neutral and Jews should enjoy the same civil rights as other religions. Mendelssohn felt that Jews should tolerate each other's religious differences. He hoped for the toleration of Jews within the broader non-Jewish European society and toleration by Jews of a wider spectrum of opinion within their own governments and congregations. Toleration of Jews. Thanks, Moses. Anyway, the philosophers wrote much on religion, but humanity was the center of their interest. Okay? Humanity, the life of human beings, all human beings. The philosophers were thinking, by the way, of men, not women, when they framed their reformist ideas. The idea of social science originated in the Enlightenment. Social science, sociology, the study of society. Okay, philosophers hoped to end human cruelty by discovering social laws and making people aware of them. These concerns are most evident in the philosophers' work on law and prison. Law and prison. Yes. In 1764, good name to remember, Cesar Beccaria wrote a book called On Crimes and Punishments, basically where he criticized the incarceration system of the era as being cruel and unjust and whatever. Beccaria wanted the laws of government to comply with the laws of nature. He attacked torture as a means of gaining confessions and also capital punishment. Torture was routinely used to elicit confessions, and torture was also meted out as punishment. He said, Beccaria said, the intent of punishment should be to deter future crimes. A noble idea. Doesn't really work. Is that a realistic claim given the amount of recidivism? And for those of you saying, reaching for your thesaurus, recidivism is the tendency of convicted criminals upon their release to go back and do the same thing again. It's really a problem. Roman numeral 13, we won't talk about. 3 strikes you're out. Philosophers believe that mercantilism hampered the expansion of trade, manufacture, and agriculture. So the philosophers were against the economic policy of mercantilism, which just about every European country used and adhered to at that point. The mercantilism, as you remember, has caused the American Revolution. Yeah. Mhm. So in France, these people were called physiocrats. The leaders of this movement were Francois Quinet and Pierre Dupont de Nemours. The physiocrats believed that the primary rule of government was to protect property and permit its owners to use that property frequently. They felt that all economic production depended upon sound agriculture. Okay, Roman numeral 14, the guy. I keep saying this one day, several of the people I'm talking to right now, all one of you, I'm just looking at that. I know more of you tune in later on. Several of the people I'm talking to right now will go to a university and major in business administration, management, economics, macroeconomics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of those business related. In fact, I know a lot of you guys are already into the business department at Ryle. And when you go to college, you will be compelled to read Adam Smith's Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. What is that book about? Laissez Faire. You know what he thought? Capitalism. That book is about capitalism. That book is about free enterprise. That book is about the idea that every person should be allowed to make as much money as they can, limited only by their own wherewithal. That's what it is. So, Adam Smith, Scottish person, he believed that liberty was the foundation of a natural economic system, in order people should be able to do whatever they want, to buy and sell products. He said the mercantilist system should be scrapped, and he was right. Smith argued that mercantilist regulations hindered the expansion of wealth and production, and he was right. The assumption of mercantilism was that resources were scarce, and therefore some gain wealth at the expense of others. Remember that mercantilism is a zero-sum philosophy. Adam Smith said, there's enough stuff for all of us to make profit. I mean, we can all find ways to make a profit. We just have to be reasonable, use logic. He saw the resources of the world as endless. Now, there, maybe not. In effect, Smith said that people of Europe need not to be poor. Smith was considered the founder of this thing called Laissez Faire, which is a French term. It means leave it alone, and favored a limited role of government in business. He thought the state should provide schools, armies, navies, and roads. In other words, the government should do things that are too big for business, such as building roads, such as building canals, such as having an army and navy to protect commerce. It should undertake dangerous commercial ventures that were economically desirable, such as building a bridge across the Ohio River, but too expensive for private enterprise. There's no business in the United States that could undertake the building of such a bridge as the one that spans the Ohio River right now, I-75. Smith came up with the four-stage theory of economics, meaning that this is the evolution of mankind in the business world. Hunters and gatherers, pastoral or herding animals, agriculture where you farm, and then finally commercial. Smith described the passage of human society through these stages as the movement from barbarism to civilization. Smith's theory allowed Europeans to look about the world and always find themselves dwelling at the highest level of human achievement. Now, so the Europeans, using Smith's ideology, using Smith's theories, if the only thing limiting you is your own capabilities. Well, what's to prevent you from going out into the lesser developed parts of the world and taking advantage of those guys? That's what he's talking about. And so the Europeans said, oh, that sounds like a good idea. And now we have more justification to rob the developing countries of the world in Africa, the Americas, and Asia. So the spirit of the Enlightenment presented themselves as carrying out a civilizing mission to the rest of the world. And within the same breath, while they're robbing the rest of the world, they're also saying, we're making you guys better people. And thanks for the diamonds, by the way. It was nice of you to dig them up for us. Roman numeral 15. The philosophers' greatest zeal for reform, though, lie in politics, particularly in France, where corruptness of the royal court, the blundering, of the administrative bureaucracy. In other words, Louis XVI was a bumbling fool. The foolhardy wars France engaged in, including the American Revolution, and the power of the Roman Catholic Church compounded all problems. The most important political thought of the Enlightenment occurred, of course, in France. The French philosophers stood divided as to the solutions of France's problems. They, meaning the philosophers, their opinions range from just simply aristocratic reform, meaning let's make the king and the nobility do a better job, to outright democracy, where get rid of the king, and to fully absolute democracy. Absolute monarchy. In other words, the philosophers didn't agree with each other. That was quite common. Charles Louis de Saint-Sagendat, also called the Baron de Montesquieu, was a lawyer. He was noble, a lawyer, member of a provincial parliament, and a member of the Bordeaux Academy of Science. He lived in luxury, but still saw the need for reform. Montesquieu published the Persian Letters to satirize contemporary appointments made by the French government. Basically, the gist of the book was two Persians visit Europe and explain to friends back at home how European behavior compared with Persian life and customs. And in the description, of course, it makes the Europeans look bad. There was humor, but also cutting criticism and an exposure of the cruelty of and irrationality, put it in there, and irrationality of much of contemporary European life. It was just a satirical book about the way that Europeans conducted things. His most enduring work, though, was Spirit of the Laws. Spirit of the Laws, which held up the example of the British form of government. Remember that Enlightenment thinkers thought that the British government was the end-all, be-all. The Enlightenment thinkers of France mainly thought that the British had gotten it right, which was really giving the British way too much credit. So Montesquieu said there could be no single set of political laws that applied to all peoples at all times and all places. And I believe that's true. What works in the United States of America doesn't necessarily work in other countries. Whether the best form of government is a monarchy or a republic, for example, depended upon that country's size, population, social and religious customs, economic structure, tradition, and climate. That's not true. Montesquieu believed that France should retain the monarchy that was tempered by some kind of aristocratic, local, and other corporate entities that the monarch would have to respect. A balance of power, you might say. Montesquieu was a political conservative. He adopted conservation in hope of achieving reforms. He believed that the degradation of French life, Montesquieu, could be blamed on the monarchy. He, once again, felt that Britain's example of division of powers with the king as the executive, legislative in the parliament, and judicial power in the courts was the best operating example to follow. Montesquieu was the one who promoted executive, legislative, judicial, which, by the way, he borrowed the idea of ancient Greece. His perception of the British system was incorrect, by the way. Yeah, it was really giving the British too much credit at the time. Remember that until 1832, less than 5% of the population of Great Britain could actually participate in government in any way, shape, or form. He failed to see how patronage means paying money, and electoral corruption allowed a handful of powerful aristocrats to dominate the government in Britain. He was also aware of how the emerging cabinet system was slowly making the executive power part of the parliament. You say, what does that mean? Well, today in England, they used to have a king and he was the executive. Well, today the royal family in England, nobody pays any attention to them about really. I mean, yeah, people listen to them, but they have no real executive authority. And they don't want it, to be honest. But the executive authority of the British government is vested in the Prime Minister, who's a member of Parliament. That's what he's talking about. Misspelled Parliament Court. Yes. He felt that monarchs should be subject to the limits of governing, and the legislature should set those limits. That couldn't have been. Now, see, you got to look at, you need to look at bias. When you're analyzing documents, why would Montesquieu say something like that? Could it be because he himself was a member of a parliament that he said that? Jean-Jacques Rousseau was different from Montesquieu. Jean-Jacques Rousseau formed few close relationships except with the women who he had impregnated and then dumped their kids off. He sired many children whom he simply just dumped off at the foundling hospitals. Admirable man. However, Montesquieu had a deep antipathy towards the world and society in which he lived. In other words, Montesquieu was supposed to be all about morality, and yet he would go and have sex with as many women as he could, impregnate those women, and take the child from that union and then drop them off at the foundling hospitals and go on his merry way. What a guy. So, in his discourse on the moral effects of the arts and sciences, he contended that the process of civilization and enlightenment had corrupted human nature. In 1755, in his discourse on the origin of inequality, Rousseau blamed much of the evil in the world on the uneven distribution of property. Has a point. Other philosophers felt that life would get better for people if they just had more material goods. Rousseau actually questioned what actually made up the good life. His most comprehensive discussion of politics took place in his book called The Social Contract. This is where it gets confusing. The Social Contract by Rousseau is a book. The Social Contract Theory of Government is by John Locke. The idea that the government and the governed make a contract. This is The Social Contract, the book by Rousseau. It is confusing. The Social Contract was a very abstract book that does not propose specific reforms, but outlines the kind of political structure that Rousseau believed would overcome the evils of contemporary society. Rousseau said, all men are born free, but everywhere they are in chains. Well, maybe if you quit impregnating women and having these children who have no recourse, then they wouldn't be born in chains. But that's okay, Rousseau. We'll give you a pass on that. The rest of the volume is a defense of the chains of a properly organized society over its members. Rousseau suggested that society is more important than its individual members because what they are what they are only by virtue of their relationship to the larger community. Rousseau, agreeing with Plato and John Calvin, said freedom was the obedience of the law. The law to be obeyed was termed the general will. In other words, Rousseau said, you shouldn't revolt. You shouldn't do that because that's not what's good for society overall. He said that people would be restrained by this thing called the general will, the will of majority of voting eligible citizens. Rousseau believed that the general will, thus understood, must always be right, and that to obey the general will was to be free. Rousseau would have disagreed with Adam Smith's major premise in Wealth of Nations and would have preferred a study on the virtue of nations. Adam Smith says, do what you want to do to make money. Rousseau says, no, no, no. Do what is good for the people. Smith wanted to be prosperous. Rousseau wanted them to be good, even if being good might mean that they remain poor, as were many of the children Rousseau fathered and left at foundling hospitals. I can't get past that, I'm sorry. Rousseau, Thomas Jefferson. But let's put a statue up to Thomas Jefferson again now. As a way of keeping people loyal and content, he suggested that properly governed society should decree a civic religion based on the creed of deism. Many of the leaders of the French Revolution were avid readers of Rousseau and were critical of the general tenor and direction of Western culture. Roman numeral 17. Yes. Women in the Enlightenment, especially in France, helped significantly to promote the careers of the philosophers. They made coffee. They hosted salons. But could they really play? Could they involve themselves in discussions? No, not at all. Salons in Paris were gathering spots for the philosophers where they would sit around, drink coffee and alcohol, and talk about ideas. The women who organized these salons were well connected to major political figures who could help the philosophers and secure pensions for them. The Marquis De Pompadour was the mistress of Louis XV and actually overcame the attempted censorship of the encyclopedia. The philosophers were not feminist. End of story. Montesquieu maintained in general the status of women in society was the result of the climate of the political regime, its culture, and women's physiological nature. In other words, the fact that they are weak. I'm just doing some corrections here. There it is. He believed that women were not naturally inferior to men and they should have a wider role in society. He did recognize the double standard placed upon women, with their worth being connected to their appearance, which was linked to their age. I mean, that's too simple to be explained. To this very day, a woman's worth is connected to her appearance. No matter what's inside of her. I mean, it really does. You know, it's a horrible thing. And quite true. I mean, when a woman, and I've seen it before, when, for example, I'm getting off Nancy Pelosi, a lot of people really hate Nancy Pelosi. And, to me, she's just another politician. But the first thing they attack about her is whatever they perceive to be wrong or right about her appearance, So back to the matter at hand. I mean, look at me, I'm wearing a t-shirt, but I'm a great teacher. Teacher and t-shirt. Maybe I should start a trend. I'm sorry, it's getting late. 5 more minutes, guys. Give me 5 more minutes. 7. All right. Thank you, Mr. Lynn. In the summertime, you're going to miss me. That's right. I used to try to put forward the idea of the administration of having, they have summer school in summer for students who need to make up stuff. I always thought that one of the things they should do in summer school is have enrichment programs for students who, want to get ahead, students who want to learn more in depth about something. I always would have liked to have taught some enrichment courses. Enrichment courses, that's a nerd mana. And I'm a nerd. Sorry, I've wasted a minute. So, Montesquieu did indicate a belief in the traditional view of marriage and family and expected men to dominate these institutions. For although he supported the right of women to divorce and opposed laws directly oppressive of women, he upheld the ideal of female chastity, not male. The views about women expressed in the encyclopedia were less generous to women than Montesquieu. Women were not recruited by Denis Diderot to contribute to the Enlightenment Encyclopedia. Most of the articles in the Enlightenment Encyclopedia that dealt with women specifically, or that discussed women in connection with other subjects, often emphasize women's natural physical weakness, their inferiority, which of course was attributed to menstruation and childbearing. So therefore, they're weaker individuals. The article also typifies women as frivolous and unconcerned with important issues. The encyclopedia discussed women primarily in a family context as wives, daughters, and mothers. Motherhood was the most important occupation of women, according to the Enlightenment Encyclopedia, and the encyclopedist upheld the double standard when it came to women's sexuality. Jean-Jacques Rousseau urged a very conservative and traditional role for women. In his book, Emile, I should have italicized that, which I'm doing right now. In Emile, he set forth a radical version of the view that men and women occupy different spheres. Women here, men there. Women should be educated for a position subservient to men. In his view, women had little role but to make themselves pleasing to men. He wrote Rousseau, yeah. Women were weaker than men in all capacities except for their capacity of feeling, this is so sexist, feeling and giving love. In spite of these views, and in spite of his own ill treatment of his own wife, who bore him many children, Rousseau achieved a vast following amongst women in the 18th century. Yeah, even though he had this reputation for being a womanizer, women in the 18th century loved him. He is credited with convincing upper-class women to breastfeed their children instead of wet nursing them to poor women, because wet nursing was another way of elitism, he thought. In 1792, here we go, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote a vindication of the rights of woman, in which she was critical of Rousseau and the general stand toward women in Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Wollstonecraft, who died shortly after giving birth to Mary Shelley, accused Rousseau and others like him of attempting to narrow women's vision and limit their experience. Wollstonecraft was demanding for women the kind of liberty that male writers of the Enlightenment had been championing for men for more than a century. She broadened the agenda of the Enlightenment to include the rights of women as well as those of men, and she was roundly ignored, not through any fault of her own. So, the monarchs of the time, Frederick the Great of Prussia, Joseph II of Austria, Catherine the Great of Russia, liked to believe that they too were forward-thinking, that they were smart. And they call themselves enlightened despots. Most philosophers were not opposed to power if they could find a way of using that power for their own purposes, or if they could profit in one way or another from their relationships with the strong monarchs. In other words, a lot of these philosophers sold out to the monarchs. Yeah, that's what it means. Voltaire was a strong monarchist. Philosophers sought to redirect the power of the monarchs towards the rationalization of economic. In other words, they tried to get the monarchs to buy into what they were saying. Enlightened absolutism referred to the phenomenon of absolute rulers seeming to embrace the ideas of the Enlightenment. Frederick II kept a place for Voltaire in his court. Catherine the Great kept all the volumes of Voltaire, all the volumes of the Enlightenment Encyclopedia. Joseph II imposed a series of religious, legal, and social reforms that contemporaries believe had come from the philosophes. I mean, yeah, Joseph II, of all the monarchs, were probably the most enlightened. Many monarchs adopted Enlightenment policies, favoring the rational economic and social integration of their realms, because these policies also increased the military strength. In other words, many of the ideas of the Enlightenment actually helped monarchs to become stronger. Some philosophers could be influenced by the flattery and attention of the monarchy. Surprise, surprise. Even though Voltaire opposed war, he praised Catherine the Great's excursions in the, you say, what is that, excursions? Catherine the Great invaded the Ottoman Empire, and Voltaire went, way to go, girl. Which is obviously an act that would be in opposition to most ideas of the Enlightenment, of one people conquering another. But Voltaire said, well, you know, this is okay, because Catherine the Great is just trying to make the Ottoman Empire civilized by invading it. We're going to stop there, and we'll begin Roman numeral 19 tomorrow. And I think we should finish this unit tomorrow and move on to our next one. But yeah, if you did not get something from College Board today, look in your clutter folder, look in your junk mail, and then start asking questions. Okay, I'm going to bug out now. Look at your the results of your DBQ. Look at the, of course, the test grades. School is not over. We have one more review test. That is Friday. Okay, and I'm going to bug out. So have an awesome day.